Darkness always came to his house with silence. There were hours that stretched on endlessly while he waited listening, catching that shuddering moment when the breathing behind the wall became steady, when it was safe to begin. Alexander had never considered himself a maniac. He just loved people, in his own way, in love with their skin, the curves of their bones, the music that burst from his throat when his fingers clenched too tightly. Tonight he waited for Olga. She had come on her own, like all of them. "Do you live here all alone?" she asked, peering into the semi-darkness of his apartment. "Yes," he nodded, smiling, "but I'm never lonely." Olga laughed, threw off her coat and stepped inside. She had habits like everyone else. She looked for the light switch. He let her find it. A dim light flickered on, too faint to dispel the darkness in the far corner, where a heavy wooden table covered with a thick cloth stood. "It smells strange," she remarked, frowning. Alexander closed the door behind her. "It's just an old house," he said. He was lying. The smell was fresh. Olga didn't know that it was here, under this very table, that the one who had been here before her was waiting in silence. Olga kicked off her boots, threw her bag on the chair, and walked across the room, looking around. "It's cozy here," she said with a slight strain in her voice. Alexander watched carefully. He loved this moment when they still didn't realize where they'd gotten to. "Would you like some wine?" he asked, approaching the kitchen cupboard. Olga shrugged her shoulders. "Why not?" He poured it for her. She didn't realize the glass was already waiting, prearranged. He watched as she took it in her fingers, brought it to her lips, as the liquid touched her tongue. A pause. "It's bitter," she murmured and set the glass on the table, as if. Her eyes suddenly focused. She looked at the table, at the cloth that covered its surface. "What do you have here?" She reached for the cloth, but Alexander was faster. He grabbed her hand, squeezed it. "Don't touch it." Her lips opened and the first, almost invisible grain of fear appeared in her eyes. "What are you doing?" She grinned nervously, trying to pull her hand away. He didn't say anything, just stared at her. Olga jerked harder. "Okay, that's enough. I have to go." She didn't finish the sentence. The lights flickered. The room seemed to darken for a second, and under that flickering light, Alexander saw the reflection in her eyes the moment she realized. She felt movement. Under the table. Something moved there, under the cloth. And a second before she could scream, he reached forward and clamped his hand over her mouth. Olga's warm breath beat against Alexander's palm. She wriggled, kicking at his legs, but he was stronger. He was used to it and knew how to hold, where to squeeze, when to loosen his grip so they didn't pass out too soon. Olga's eyes darted around, reflecting panic, terror, and understanding. She had heard it. Something was moving under the table, scratching the floor, moaning. "MMM," she tried to scream, but the sound was extinguished in his fingers. Alexander grinned softly. "I didn't want you to find out so soon." Olga pressed into him, trying to push him away, but he only pushed her toward the table. The dense fabric trembled with the movement beneath her. "You wanted to know what's in here? All right, take a look." With one hand he held her firmly, with the other he tore the cloth away. Olga saw. What lay on the table was still breathing. A cut-up body, sewn together with coarse black threads, eyes rolled back, mouth open in a mute scream, lips twitching as if trying to utter the last words. "It's," Alexander muttered, running his hand through the hair of the creature that had once been human. "This is Eve. She was the first, and she's still with us." The creature twitched. Its fingers, laced together, moved slightly. Olga let out a muffled sob, but Alexander stopped her from screaming. "Now you'll be part of the family, too," he whispered. Something under the table began to come out. Olga did not resist anymore. Her eyes widened, her lips trembled, and her breathing became frequent and convulsive. She couldn't take her eyes off what lay on the table. Eve hissed. Her neck twitched, as if something was trying to regain control of her own body. Stitched fingers scraped weakly on the wooden surface. "She's alive," Olga exhaled, her voice breaking into a wheeze. Alexander grinned softly. "I don't kill immediately. It makes the process more intimate." He leaned in close to Olga's ear, enjoying the way she flinched. "You don't realize how much you can love someone when they become your art." He felt her breathing become ragged, panic. He knew that at that moment 100 thoughts ran through her head in a second. Rush forward, push him away, rush for the exit. but she realized too late that there was no chance. A second hand emerged from under the table. Not Eva's. Something was there, in the darkness, something else. Olga wanted to scream, but only a wheeze escaped her throat. She felt thin fingers, icy and clammy, slowly reach for her leg. "You're part of the family now, too," Alexander whispered, pressing her into the table. When the darkness grabbed her ankle, she screamed. But that scream was not heard by anyone. Olga was convulsing, trying to break free, but the hands from under the table gripped her ankle tightly. Ice-cold fingers dug into her skin, pulling her down into the darkness. "Let me go," she wheezed, but Alexander only tilted his head, admiring her fear. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, running his finger along her cheek. "The family will accept you." In the next instant, something burst out from under the table. Human, but not quite. Its body was stitched together from different parts, alien limbs, skin of different shades, stitches pulling the pieces of meat together. His face, it wasn't whole. It seemed like scraps stretched over his skull, stitched together with coarse threads. One eye rolled into an empty eye socket. The other looked straight at Olga meaningfully. "Help me," the creature whispered. Olga shrieked. The power of terror gave her resolve. She jerked backward, lashing out with her foot, aiming for the monster's head. The limb met its face. The fabric burst, and some of the flesh slid down, exposing dark, wet bone. The creature groaned. Alexander frowned. "You're hurting it," he muttered disappointedly. Olga didn't listen. Her instincts were screaming, "Run!" She crashed into Alexander, pushed him away, sprinted for the door. Her heart was pounding in her chest. Adrenaline was screaming in her veins. Her legs were burning with tension. She was almost there. Almost reached the doorknob. But something stabbed into her back. A blade. Thin, surgically sharp. Warmth spilled down her back. Olga froze, her lips ajar. She couldn't breathe. Alexander stood behind her, clutching the knife. "Don't go." His voice was soft, almost gentle. "I like you." Olga felt the ground slipping from under her feet, and the darkness swallowed her. Olga wheezed. Blood ran down her back, hot, sticky. Her head was noisy, her body weakened. She felt the ground slipping away from under her feet, cold fingers gripping her again, no longer by her ankles, but by her arms, her neck, her hair, pulling her down. Alexander laid her gently on the floor. He sat down beside her, leaned over, smiling as tears rolled down her cheeks. "See, it's not so terrible." His voice sounded almost affectionate. "You just resisted for too long." Olga opened her mouth, trying to speak, to scream, to say something, but instead of words only a faint, gurgling sound came out. "Shoo!" Alexander put his finger to her lips. "Now rest. Soon you will be beautiful." Darkness covered her. Olga woke up from the cold. The first thing she felt was something prickling her skin. The second was that she couldn't move. An attempt to inhale and a sharp pain pierced her chest. She opened her eyes and immediately regretted it. She was lying on the very same table. The cloth that had concealed the horror was now soaked with her own blood. Her hands were sewn to the wooden surface. Through the tears and the shroud of pain, she saw movement. In a dark corner of the room, Eve stared at her. The stitched face trembled, the thread-tight lips parted, and a wet, gurgling wheeze came from them. "P help," the creature wheezed. And then Alexander appeared in the doorway. The scalpel in his hand gleamed in the dim light. He was smiling. "Shall we begin?" Alexander ran the scalpel across her cheek, not cutting the skin, just feeling how it trembled under the blade. "You're special, Olga," he murmured. "I felt it from the first minute." Her chest heaved, her eyes darted around, but her body wouldn't listen. The blood in her veins was beating like an alarm, but there was no way out. Alexander smiled. "You know, I've never loved anyone the way I love you." He leaned closer, so that his lips were almost touching her ear. "That's why I want you to be different." His hand slid to her wrist, took the scalpel, and then something changed. The scalpel froze. Alexander's hand began to tremble. His lips opened, but instead of words, only a faint, hoarse sound escaped from his throat. Olga realized that something had gone wrong. His eyes opened wide, and he looked at his fingers as if he didn't recognize them. His hand clenched convulsively, and then began to curve at an unnatural angle. "What?" he breathed out, losing control of his body. He suddenly jerked away from Olga, grabbing his head. No, no, not now. In the next second, he wailed. His back arched, fingers digging into his own face, nails tearing the skin. He shuddered, thrashing against the walls, scattering tools. Something was inside him. Something he himself hadn't expected. Olga stared at it, almost unable to believe her eyes. From the shadows came another voice. Eva's voice. He thought he was controlling us, but we waited. Alexander screamed, his body shaking, his joints wrenching, foam coming out of his mouth. He made us part of himself. Eva rose slowly from her seat. But now we controlled him. Alexander wheezed. His skin was bursting, his muscles contracting in agony. He was no longer human. Olga felt hopeful for the first time all night. But hope is a terrible thing. Because from his throat came a laugh. Hoarse, low, inhuman. He raised his head. And what was looking at Olga was no longer Alexander. Olga was breathing heavily, her muscles burning with pain, but fear completely superseded her suffering. Alexander stood before her, but it was no longer him. His skin trembled like a taut film, and something was moving underneath it, as if dozens of hands, faces, bodies were trying to get out. His eyes darkened, irises gone, leaving only pupils filled with emptiness. "We see you," came not one, but several voices at once. Dozens of different voices screamed from his throat, female, male, children. Voices of those he killed. And Eve was one of them. "He made us parts of himself," she whispered, moving toward Olga. "He wanted us to belong to him, but now..." She slowly turned her head toward Alexander. "Now he belongs to us." Alexander twitched convulsively, his face contorted, his mouth opened as if someone inside was trying to get out. "And no, I am the master. I'm in control." Crunch. His body twisted too sharply, his spine couldn't take it, and something inside him exploded. His arms jerked convulsively, his fingers reaching for her throat, tearing the flesh to shreds. Olga wanted to close her eyes, but she couldn't tear her gaze away. Alexander began to dismantle himself. His fingers were tearing muscles, his nails were ripping out tendons, his face was spreading like a wax mask. "We are free," came Eva's voice. Alexander's last scream merged into a chorus of voices, and suddenly broke off. He collapsed to his knees. His body settled, froze. Olga felt something change. There was a dead silence. She clenched her eyes shut, her heart pounding in her chest, each beat reverberating with pain. When she opened her eyes again, Alexander was gone. Only scraps of his clothes, blood, and skin, thrown to the floor like an unwanted shell. Olga had survived. But someone else was looking at her now. She turned her head slowly. Eva stood closer. She was no longer trembling, no longer moaning, no longer a victim. Now that Alexander was gone, someone had to take his place. Eva smiled. "Your turn." Silence hung over her like a heavy blanket. There was no more life in the room, only shadows and blood. Olga stood as if in a trance, unable to believe her eyes. Everything she saw seemed too distant and out of place for reality. She took a step forward, her heart pounding frantically in her chest. Eve didn't move, her smile as cold, cruel as a knife blade. "Your turn," she repeated, like an echo in an empty room. Olga couldn't take her eyes off the figure that stood before her. She didn't know what to expect. Run away? There was no place to go. To beg? That wouldn't change anything. She felt the same thing growing in her chest that was in Alexander's eyes, emptiness, the way he felt when he became part of their terrifying world. Footsteps. The first steps to the table. A cloth lay heavy beneath his feet, blood smeared across the floor, and silence ringing in his ears. It was the same silence that comes after death when it's all over. Olga bowed her head, her eyes clouded over. There was fear in her chest, but not only that, there was something else, something familiar and inevitable. Eve walked over to her. She was no longer a victim. She was free. She was new, and Olga felt it pulling at her, as if the same thing awaited her. "This isn't the end," Eva said, sliding her gaze over her face. "This is rebirth. You're part of us now." Olga felt a chill pulsing through her chest. Eva's hand touched her neck, gently, but with force, as if she were part of this eternal, terrible game. The last thing she saw was her own reflection in Eva's eyes, and there was nothing human in those eyes. The body that lay on the table was now hers,